Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Georges Guynemer, Night of the Air, by Henry Bordeaux. Canto 3, At the Zenith. 1. On the 25th of May, 1917.
The destiny of a Guynemer is to surpass himself. Part of his power, however, must lie in the perfection of his weapons. Why could he not forge them himself? In him, the mechanician and the gunsmith were impatient to serve the pilot and the fighter. Nothing in the science of aviation was unknown to him, and Guynemer in the factory was always the same Guynemer. He worked with the same nervous tension when he overhauled his machine guns to avoid the too frequent and too troublesome jamming, or when he improved the arrangement of the instruments and tools in his airplane in accordance with his superior practical experience, as when he chased an enemy. He wanted to compel the obedience of matter, as he compelled the enemy to surrender. In the Somme campaign, he had forced down 2 airplanes in a single day, and then 4 in 2 days. In Lorraine, he was to do even better. At that time, the beginning of 1917, the German aerial forces were very active in Lorraine, but the city of Nancy paid no attention to them. In 1914, Nancy had seen the invading army broken against the mountain of Sainte-Geneviève and the Grand Couronne. She had withstood a bombardment by gigantic shells and visits from air squadrons, and all without losing her good humor and her animation. She was one of those cities on the front who are accustomed to danger, and who find in it an inspiration for courage, for commerce, and even for pleasure, which does not belong to cities behind the lines. Sometimes people who were dining on the Place Stanislas left their tables to watch some fine battle in the air, after which they resumed their seats and their appetites, merely replacing Rhenish by Moselle wines. Nevertheless, the frequency of raids and the destruction caused by bombs began to make the existence of both native and visiting Nancyites decidedly unpleasant. The Stork's escadrille, which arrived in February, very promptly punished these aerial brigands by a police policy both rapid and severe. The enemy airplanes which flew over Nancy were vigorously chased, and less than a month later the framework of a good dozen of them, arranged in an orderly manner around the statue of Stanislas Leczinski, reassured the population and served as an interesting spectacle for the visitor who could no longer have the pleasure of admiring, behind Lemoore's gates, the 2 monumental fountains consecrated to Neptune and Amphitrite by Gobal, and which were then covered by coarse sacks of earth. Guynemer had contributed his share of these spolia opima. On March 16th, he alone had forced down 3 Boches, and a 4th on the 17th. 3 victories in one day constituted a novel exploit. Navarre had achieved a double victory on February 26, 1916, at Verdun, and Guynemer had the same success on the Somme. In this campaign, Nungesser had burned a Draken and 2 airplanes in one morning, but 3 airplanes destroyed in one day had never been seen before. On that same evening, Guynemer wrote to his family, and I transcribe the letter just as it is, with neither heading nor final formula. The King of Spain, in Ruy Blas, talks of the weather before he tells of the 6 wolves he has killed, but the new Cid fought in all weathers and speaks of nothing but his chase, 9 o'clock. Rose from the ground on hearing shell explosions, forced down in flames a 2-seated albatross at 9:08, 9:20. Attacked with Doyen, a group of 3 one-seated albatross, famous on the Lorraine front. At 9:26 I brought one down almost intact, pilot wounded, Lieutenant von Hausen, nephew of the general, and Doyen brought down another in flames at the same time. About 9 o'clock, Dorm and Auger had attacked and grilled a 2-seated plane. These 4 Boches were in a quadrilateral, the sides of which measured 5 kilometers, 4.5 kilometers, 3 kilometers, and 3 kilometers. Those who were in the middle need not have bothered themselves, but they were completely distracted. 1430 forced down a 2-seated albatross in flames. 3 Boches within our lines for my day's work. Oof, GG. Guynemer, who had been promoted lieutenant in February and was to be made captain in March, treated this Lieutenant von Hausen humanely and courteously as soon as he had landed. In all his mentions up to that time, Guynemer had been described as a brilliant chasing pilot. He was now mentioned as an incomparable chasing pilot. Early in April, the Storks left Lorraine and went to make their nests on a plateau on the left bank of the Aisne, back of Fismes. New events were in preparation. After the German retreat to the Hindenburg Line, the French army in connection with the English army, which was to attack Vimy Cliffs, April 9 to 10, 1917, was about to undertake that vast offensive operation which, from Soissons to Auberive in Champagne, was to roll like an ocean wave over the slopes of the Chemin des Dames, the hills of Sapignol and Brimont, and the Moronvillers Mountain. Hearts were filled with hope, and the men were inspired by a sacred joy. Their sufferings and their wounds did not prevent the hearts of the soldiers in that spring of 1917 from flowering in sublime sacrifices for the cause of liberty. As at the Battle of the Somme, so at the Battle of the Aisne, our aerial escadrilles were in close touch with the General Staff and the other arms of the service. Their success was no doubt dependent upon the quality of the airplanes and the factory output, and limited by the enemy's power in the air. But though they were unable to achieve the mastery of the air from the very first, they continued obstinately to increase their force, and little by little their successes increased. They had to oppose an enemy who had just accomplished an immense improvement in his aviation corps. In September 1916, the German staff, profiting by the lessons of the Somme campaign during which its aviation forces had been so terribly scourged, resolved upon an almost complete reorganization of its aeronautical service. Hindenburg's program arranged for a rehandling of both the direction and the technical services. A decree dating from November 1916 announced the separation from the other services of the air fight forces, Luftstreitkräfte, which were to be placed under a staff officer, the Kommandeur der Luftstreitkräfte. This new Kommandeur, who was to superintend the building of the machines as well as the training of the pilots, was Lieutenant General von Huppner, with Lieutenant Colonel Chomson as an assistant. The squadrons, numbering more than 270, were divided into bombing, chasing, patrolling, and field escadrilles, these last being entrusted with scouting, photographing, and artillery work, in constant touch with the infantry. Most of these novelties were servilely copied from French aviation. The Germans had borrowed the details of liaison service, as well as those for the regulation of artillery fire, from the French regulations. The commander of the aeronautical section of the 5th German Army, Verden, said in a report that a conscientious aviator was the only reliable informant in action. And his supreme chief, the Kronprinz, commenting upon this sentence, drew the following conclusions. All this shows once more that through methodical use of infantry aviation, the command can be kept informed of developments through the whole battle. But the necessary condition for fruitful work in the field lies in a previous training carried on with the infantry, machine guns, artillery, and liaison units. The task of the infantry flyer is apt to become more difficult as the weather grows worse, and ground more deeply plowed up, the enemy more pressing, or our own troops yielding ground. When all these unfavorable circumstances are united, the infantry aviator can only be effective if he has perfect training. So he must be in constant contact with the other services, and the infantry must know him personally. At a pinch, he ought to make himself understood by the troops, even without any of the usual signals. But these airplanes, while doing this special work, must be protected by patrolling escadrilles. The best protection is afforded by the chasing units, fitted to spread terror and death far afield, or to stop enemy escadrilles bound on a similar errand. Here again, copying the French services, Germany strengthened her chasing escadrilles during the whole winter of 1916 to 1917, and by the following spring she possessed no less than 40. Before the war she had given her attention almost exclusively to heavy airplanes. French types were plagiarized. As the Morane had been altered into the Fokker, the Nieuport became an Albatros. Their one-seated 160-horsepower Albatros, with a Benz or Mercedes fixed engine and 2 Maxim guns shooting through the propeller, was henceforth the typical chasing machine. However, the powerful 2-engine Gothas, 520 horsepower, and the Friedrichshafen and AEG 450 horsepower soon made their appearance in bombing escadrilles. At the same time, the defensive attitude adopted at the beginning of the Somme campaign was repudiated. The order of the day became strong concentration, likely to secure, at least in one sector, decided superiority in the air, even if other sectors must be left destitute or battle shirked. The flying men were never to be overworked, so as to be fresh in an emergency. The subordination of aviation to the other services was evidently an inspiration from the French regulation saying, "The aviation forces shall be always ready to attack, but in perfect subordination to the orders of the commanding officers." In spite of this readiness to attack, the enemy recommended prudence in scouting and patrolling work. The airman was not to engage in a fight without special orders. He seldom cruises by himself, and most often is one of 5. To one Belka, fond of high altitudes and given to pouncing falcon-like on his prey, like Guynemer, there are scores of Richthofens who, under careful protection from other airplanes, circle round and round trying to attract the enemy, and unexpectedly getting behind him by a spiral or a loop. It should be said here that the German controlling boards take the pilot's word concerning the number of his victories instead of requiring, as the French do, the evidence of eyewitnesses. The high figures generously allowed to a Richthofen or a Werner Voss are less creditable than the strictly controlled record of a Guynemer, a Nungesser, or a Dorm. The enemy expected in April 1917 a massive attack from the French air forces in the Aisne and had taken measures to evade it. An order from the staff of the 7th Army says that all flying units shall be given the alarm whenever a large number of French airplanes are sighted. The German machines must return to camp at once, refusing combat except on equal terms, and balloons must be lowered or even pulled down to the ground. If, on the contrary, the German machines took the offensive, the order was that, at the hour determined upon, all available machines must rise together to a low altitude and divide into 2 distinct fleets, the chasing units flying above the rest. These 2 fleets must then make for the point of attack, gaining height as they go, and must engage the enemy above the lines with the utmost energy, never giving up the pursuit until they reach the French lines, when the danger from anti-aircraft batteries becomes too great. From this, it is evident that the preference of German aviation for taking the offensive was not sufficient to induce it to offer battle above the enemy lines, and the tendency of the staff was to group squadrons into overpowering masses. The French had preceded their opponents in the way of technical progress, but the Germans made up for the inferiority, as usual, by method and system. The French were unrivaled for technical improvements and the training of their pilots. Their new machine, the Spad, was a first-rate instrument, superior in strength, speed, and ease of control to the best Albatros, and the Germans knew that this inferiority must be obviated. All modern battles are thus preceded by technical rivalry. The preparation in factories, week after week and month after month, ultimately results in living machinery which the staff uses as it pleases. Living machinery it is, but it is in appearance only that it seems to be independent of man. A battle is a collective work, to which each participant, from the general-in-chief to the road-mender behind the lines, brings his contribution. Colossal though the whole seems, perfect as the enormous machine seems to be, it would not work if there were not behind it a weak man made of poor flesh. A humble gunner, the anonymous defenders of a trench, a pilot who purges the air of the hostile presence, an observer who secures information in good time, some poor soldier who has no idea that his individual action was connected with the great drama, has occasionally brought about wonderful results, as a stone falling into a pool makes its presence felt to the remotest banks. Amidst the fighters on the Aisne, Guynemer was at his post in the Stork's escadrille. "All right, they tumble down," he wrote laconically to his family. There were indeed some 5 tumbling down. On May 25th, he had surpassed all that had been done so far in aerial fights, bringing down 4 German machines in that one day. His notebook states the fact briefly. 8:30, downed a 2-seater which lost a wing as it fell and was smashed on the trees 1,200 meters northeast of Corbeny. 8:31, another 2-seater downed in flames above Juvancourt. With Captain Auger, forced another 2-seater to dive down to 600 meters 1 kilometer from our lines. Downed a DFW in flames above Corlondon. Downed a 2-seater in flames between Guignecourt and Condé-sur-Suippe. dispersed with Captain Auger a squadron of 6 one-seaters. Now His Excellency Lieutenant General von Heipner, Kommandeur der Luftstreitkräfte, being interviewed 2 days later by newspaper men he had summoned for the purpose, told them and through them told Germany and, if possible, the whole world, that the German airplanes and the German airmen were unrivaled. As for the French aviators, he went on to say remarkably apropos, they only engage our men when they are sure of victory. When they have doubts about their own superiority, they prefer to desist rather than take any risks. This solemn lie the newspaper men repeated at once in their issues of May 28th. A few months later, one of these same reporters, reverting to the subject of French aviation, took Guynemer himself to task in the Badische Presse for August 8, 1917, as follows. The airman you see flying so high is the famous Guynemer. He is the rival of the most daring German aviators, an as the French call their champions. He is undoubtedly to be reckoned with, for he handles his machine with absolute mastery, and he is an excellent shot. But he only accepts an air fight when every chance is on his side. He flies above the German lines at altitudes between 6,000 and 7,000 meters, quite out of range of our anti-aircraft artillery. He cannot make any observations, for from that height he sees nothing clearly, not even troops on the march. He is exclusively a chasing flyer bent on destroying our own machines. He has been often successful, though he cannot be compared to our own Richthofen. He is very prudent, always flying, as I said above, at an altitude of at least 6,000 meters. He waits till an airplane rises from the German lines or appears on its way home. Then he pounces upon it as a falcon might and opens fire with his machine gun. When he only wounds the pilot, or if our airman seems to show fight, Guynemer flies back to his own lines at the incredible speed of 250 kilometers an hour, which his very powerful machine makes possible. He never accepts a fair fight. Every man chases as he can. Every man chases as he can. Quite so. To revert to that 25th of May, the very prudent Guynemer, on his morning patrol, met 3 German airplanes flying towards the French lines. They were 2-seaters, less nimble, no doubt, than 1-seaters, but provided with so much more dangerous arms. Naturally, he could not think of attacking them, not feeling sure of victory, and always avoiding a risky contest. Yet he pounced upon his 3 opponents, who promptly turned back. However, he overtook one, began making evolutions around him, succeeded in getting slightly below him, fired, and with his first volley succeeded in bringing him down in flames north of Corbeny, northeast of Craon. The danger for a 1-seater is to be surprised from behind. Just as Guynemer veered round, he saw another machine flying after him. He again fired upwards, and the airplane fell in flames like the first, only a few seconds having elapsed between the 2 fights. Guynemer then returned to camp. But he was excited by these 2 fights. His nerves were strained, and his will was tense. He soon started again. Towards noon, a German machine appeared above the camp itself. How had it been able to get there? This is what the airmen down below were asking themselves. It was useless to chase it, for it would take any of them longer to rise than the German to escape. So they had to content themselves with looking up, some of them searching the sky with binoculars. Everybody was back except Guynemer when somebody suddenly cried, "Here comes Guynemer!" Then the Boche is done for. Guynemer, in fact, was coming down upon his prey like lightning, and the instant he was behind and slightly beneath him, he fired. Only 1 shot from the machine gun was heard, but the enemy airplane was already spinning down, its engine going full speed, and was dashed into the earth at Corlinden near Fismes. The pilot had been shot through the head. In the afternoon, the very prudent Guynemer started for the 3rd time, and towards 7 o'clock, above the Guignecourt market gardens, that is to say, in the enemy lines, he brought down another machine in flames. Very prudent is the last epithet one could have expected to see in connection with the name of Guynemer, for he rarely came home without bullet holes in his wings or even in his clothes. The Boche, being the Boche, had shown his usual respect for truth and generosity towards an adversary. Guynemer, when returning to camp after a victory, generally announced his success by making his engine work to some tune. This time the cadence was the tune of the Lampions. All the neighboring airplane sheds understood, Also the cantonments, parks, depots, dugouts, field hospitals, and railway stations. In a word, all the communities scattered behind the lines of an army. This time the motor was singing so insistently that everybody with faces upturned concluded that their Guynemer had been getting them. In fact, the news was already spreading like wildfire, as news has the mysterious capacity for doing. No, it was not simply one airplane he had set ablaze, it was two, one above Corbeny, the other above Juvincourt, and people had hardly realized the wonderful fact before the third machine was seen falling in flames near Fismes. It was seen by hundreds of men who thought it was about to fall upon them and ran for shelter. Meanwhile, Guynemer's engine was singing, and for the fourth time it was heard again at twilight. Could it be possible? Had Guynemer really succeeded 4 times? 4 machines brought down in one day by one pilot was what no infantryman, gunner, pioneer, territorial, Annamite, or Senegalese had ever seen. And from the stations, field hospitals, dugouts, depots, parks, and cantonments, while the setting sun lingered in the sky on this May evening, whoever handled a shovel, a pickaxe, or a rifle, whoever laid down rails, unloaded trucks, piled up cases, or broke stones on the road, whoever dressed wounds, gave medicine, or carried dead men, whoever worked, rested, ate, or drank, whoever was alive, in a word, stepped out, ran, jostled along, arrived at the camp, got helter-skelter over the fences, broke into the sheds, searched the airplanes, and called to the mechanicians in their wild desire to see Guynemer. There they were, a whole town of them, knocking at every door and peeping into every tent. Somebody said, "Guynemer is asleep." Whereupon, without a word of protest, without a sound, the crowd streamed out and scattered in the darkening fields, threading its way back to the quiet dells behind the lines. So ended the day of the greatest aerial victory.
2. A visit to Guynemer.
Sunday, June 3rd, 1917. Today, the first Sunday of June, the women from the neighboring villages came to visit the camp. Nobody is allowed to enter, but from the road you can see the machines start or land. The day was glorious, and the broad sun transfiguring these French landscapes, with their elongated valleys, their wooded ranges of hills, and generally harmonious lines suggested Greece, and one looked around for the colonnades of temples. Beyond the rolling country rose the Ain cliffs, where the fighting was incessant, though its roar was scarcely perceived. Why had these villages been attracted to this particular camp? Because they knew that here, in default of Greek temples, were young gods. They wanted to see Guynemer. The news had flown on rapid wings from hamlet to hamlet, from farm to farm, of what had happened on the 25th, and on the next day Guynemer had been almost equally successful. Several aviators had already landed, men with famous names, but the public cannot be expected to remember them all. Finally, an airplane descended in graceful spirals, landing softly and rolling along close to the railings. "Guynemer!" But the pilot, unconscious of the worshipping crowd, took off his helmet, disclosed a frowning face, and began discontentedly to examine his gun. Twice that day it had jammed, saving 2 Germans. Guynemer was like the painters of old who, by grinding their colors themselves, ensured the duration of their works. He resented not being able to make all his weapons himself, his engine, his Vickers, and his bullets. At length, he seemed willing to leave his machine and pulled off his heavy war accoutrement, which revealed a tall, flexible young man. As he rapidly approached his tent, his every motion watched by the onlookers, a private turned on him a small camera with a beseeching, "You'll permit me, mon capitaine?" "Yes, but quick." He was cross and impatient, and as he stopped, he noticed all the eyes of the women watching him ecstatically. He made a despairing gesture. His frown deepened, his figure stiffened, and the snapshot was another failure. Hardly any of his portraits are like him. Does the fact that he was tall and spare, almost beardless, with an amber-colored oval face and a regular profile, and raven hair brushed backwards, give any idea of the force that was in him? If his eyes, dark with golden reflections, could have been painted, they might no doubt have given a more accurate notion of him. His capacity for surveying all space and his prompt decision were visible in them, as well as his carefulness and his courage. Their glance was so direct, almost brutal, that it could be felt, so to speak, physically. And yet it could suddenly express a cheerful, boyish nature, or disclose his close attention to the technical problems which everlastingly engrossed his mind. Guynemer was very different from Navarre, with his powerful profile and broad chest like an eagle in repose, and different from Nungesser. The Nungesser before his wounds had so devastated his body that a medical board wanted to declare him unfit, a decision which he heroically resisted, adding to his 30 victories another triumph over physical disability. Guynemer differed from them mentally too, possessing neither their instinct nor their intuitiveness. These he replaced with scientific accuracy based on study, by a passion for flying, by method allied to fervor, by violent logic. His power was nervous and almost electric. The vicinity of danger drew sparks from him. His most daring exploits were prepared by meditation beforehand, and he never indulged in recklessness without having pondered and calculated. His action was so swift that it might seem instinctive, but under appearances the reasoning element was always present. It was now late, but he was willing to talk to us about that wonderful 25th of May, for he had no objection to talking about his enemy chasing. On the contrary, he would tell us details with the same amusement as if he related lucky plays at poker, and with the same knowing ways. There was not the least shade of affectation or of posing in his narrative, but he talked with the simplicity of a child. He told us that his third encounter had been the most enjoyable. He was coming back to lunch, had seen the impudent Germans soaring above the camp, had fired, and the man had gone down dead. After this exceedingly brief account, he laughed as usual, a fresh laugh like a girl's, and his eyes closed. He said he was sleepy. He had been out twice, and before he went again, he wanted a little rest. I remember how bustling the camp looked. It was 6:30, and the weather was wonderful, with not a cloud in the sky, for some floating white flakes in the blue could not be called clouds. But these white flakes began to multiply. They were, in fact, an enemy patrol, which had succeeded in crossing the lines and was now above us. We counted 2, 3, 4 machines, which the sparks of our exploding shells promptly surrounded, while 3 French Spads rose at full speed to meet them. As we stood watching and wondering if the enemy would accept the fight, Guynemer suddenly appeared. He had been called, and now he and his comrades, Captain Auger and Lieutenant Raymond, came running to their machines. I watched Guynemer as he was being put into his leather suit. His whole soul was in his eyes, which glared at one moving point in space as if they themselves could shoot. 3 of the German machines had already turned back, but the remaining one went on, insolently counting on his own power and speed. I shall never forget Guynemer, his face lifted, his eyes illuminated as if hypnotized by this point in space, his figure upright and stiffened like an arrow waiting to be released by the bow. Before pulling down his helmet, he gave the order. Straight at him. The engines snorted and snored, the propellers began to move. The machines rolled along, and suddenly were seen climbing almost vertically. Up above the fight was beginning, and it seemed as if the 3 starting airplanes could never reach in time the altitude of 4,000 or 5,000 meters at which it was taking place. The attacking Spad was obviously trying to get its opponent within firing range, but the German was a first-rate pilot, and dodged without losing height, banking, looping, taking advantage of the Frenchman's dead angles, and striving to get him under his machine gun. Round and round the 2 airplanes circled, when suddenly the German bolted in the direction of the Aisne cliffs. But the Spad partly caught up with him, and the aerial circling began anew, while 2 other Spads appeared, a pack after a deer. The German cleverly took advantage now of the sun, now of the evening vapors, but he was within range, and the tack-tack of a machine gun was heard. Guynemer and the other 2 were coming nearer when the Spad dropped beneath its adversary and fired upwards. The German plunged, and we expected would sink, but he righted himself and was off in an instant. However, this was Guynemer's chance. 3 shots, not more, from his gun, and the German airplane crashed down somewhere near Muizon, on the banks of the Vesle. One after another, the victorious birds came back to cover from every part of the violet and rosy sky. But joy over their success must show itself, and they indulged in all the fanciful caprioles of acrobatic aviation, spinning down in quick spirals, turning somersaults, looping or plunging in a glorious sky dance. Last of these young gods, Guynemer landed after one final circle and took off his helmet, offering to the setting sun his illuminated face, still full of the spirit of battle.
3. Guynemer in camp.
On the Somme, Guynemer was one of the great French champions. On the Aisne, he became their king. No enemy could resist him, and his daring appeared without bounds. On May 27th, he attacked alone a squadron of 6 two-seaters above Auberive at an altitude of 5,000 meters and compelled them to go down to an altitude of 3,600 meters. Before landing, he pounced on another group of 8, scattering them and bringing down one, completely smashed, with its fuselage linen in rags among the shell holes in a field. He was like the Cid Campeador, to whom the Sheikh Jabias said, "You burst forth with rays reaching to the heavens, in dazzling precedence to the eyes. You were marching, surrounded by an order of battle. No peak was too high for your height, and you were such a proud son. May the eagles all fly on your side." His feats exceeded all hopes, and his appearance in the sky fairly frightened the enemy. On June 5th, after bringing down an albatross east of Berry-au-Bac, he chased to the east of Reims a DFW, which had previously been attacked by other Spads. "My nose was right on him," says Guynemer's notebook, "when my machine gun jammed. But just then the observer raised his hands. I beckoned to him several times to veer towards our lines, but noticing that he was making straight for his own, I went back to my gun, which now worked, and fired a volley of 15 at 2,200 altitude. Immediately the machine upset, throwing the observer overboard and sank on Beru Forest." However, Guynemer's day's work was not done to his satisfaction after these 2 victories, his 44th and 45th. He attacked a group of 3, and later on a group of 4, and came back with bullets in his machine. Meanwhile, he had been made, on June 11, 1917, an officer of the Legion of Honor with the following citation: "A remarkable officer, a daring and dexterous chaser. Has been of exceptional service to the country, both by the number of his victories and by the daily example of his never-flagging courage and constantly increasing mastery. Careless of danger, he has become, by the infallibility of his methods, the most formidable opponent of German flyers. On May 25th, achieved unparalleled success, bringing down 2 machines in 1 minute and 2 more in the course of the same day. By these exploits has contributed to maintaining the courage and enthusiasm of the men who, from the trenches, have witnessed his triumphs. 45 machines brought down, 20 citations, twice wounded." This document, eloquent and accurate and tracing facts to their causes, praises in Guynemer at the same time willpower, courage, and the contagion of example. Guynemer loved the last sentence, because it associated with his fights their daily witnesses, the infantrymen in the trenches. The badge of an officer in the Legion of Honor was given to him at the Aviation camp on July 5th by General Franchet d'Espèrey, in command of the Northern armies. But this solemn ceremony had not prevented Guynemer from flying twice, the first time for 2 hours, the second flight 1 hour, on a new machine from which he expected wonders. He attacked 3 DFWs and had to land with 5 bullets in his engine and radiator. His new decoration was given him at 4 o'clock on a beautiful summer afternoon. Guynemer's comrades were present, of course, and as pleased as if the function had concerned themselves. The 11th Company of the 82nd Regiment of Infantry took its station opposite the imposing row of squadron machines, 60 in number, which stood there like race horses, as if to take part in the fete. Guynemer's well-known airplane, the Vieux Charles, was the 5th to the left, its master having required its presence, though it had been injured that very day. In front of the aviation and regimental flags, the young aviator stood by himself in his black Varius, looking slight and pale, but upright, with eyes sparkling. At a little distance, a few civilians, his own people, whom the general had invited, watched the proceedings. General Franchet d'Espèrey appeared, a robust, energetic man, and the following scene, described by one of the trench papers, the Brise d'Antenoise of the 82nd Infantry, took place. The general stopped before the young hero and eyed him with evident pleasure. Then he proclaimed him a gallant soldier, touched his 2 shoulders with his sword, as they did to champions of past ages, pinned the rosette on his coat, and embraced him. Then, to the stirring tune of Sambre et Meuse, The band and the soldiers marched in front of the new officer who, the ceremony now being over, joined his relatives some distance away. General Desperay, looking over Guynemer's vieux châle, noticed the damaged parts. "How comes it that your foot was not injured?" he asked, pointing to one of the bullet holes. "I had just removed it, mon général," said Guynemer with his usual simplicity. None of the airmen with whom Guynemer shared his joy ever forgot that afternoon of July 5, 1917. The summer sun, the serene beauty of the hills bordering the Aisne, the distant base of the battle, lent to the scene an enchanting but solemn interest. Tragic memories were in the minds of all the bystanders, and great names were on their lips. The names of retiring, noble, hard-working Dorme, reported missing on May 25th, and of Captain Lecour Grandmaison, creator of the 3-seaters, who on one of these machines brought down 5 Germans, but was killed in a combat on May 10th and brought back to camp dead by a surviving comrade. Guynemer's red rosette meant glory to the great chasers, to wounded Heurtaud, to Menard and Dollin, to Auger, Fonck, Geyer, Guérin, Baudouin, and all their comrades. And it meant glory to the pilots and observers who, always together in the discharge of duty, are not infrequently together in meeting death, to Lieutenant Fressag, pilot, and Sous-Lieutenant Bouvard, observer, who once fought 7 Germans and managed to bring one down, to Lieutenant Fleuret and Lieutenant Homo, who, placed in similar circumstances, set 2 machines on fire, to Lieutenant Viguier, who, on April 18th, had the pluck to come down to 25 meters above the enemy's lines and calmly make his observations, and to so many others who did their duty with the same daring, intelligence, and conscientiousness, to the hundreds of more humble airmen who, while the infantry says the sanguinary mass, throw down from above, like the chorister boys in the Corpus Christi procession, the red roses of epics. The whole Storks Escadrille had received from General Duchesne the following citation: Escadrille No. 3, Commander, Captain Heurtaud. A brilliant chasing escadrille which for the past 2 years has fought in every sector of the front with wonderful spirit and admirable self-sacrifice. The squadron has just taken part in the Lorraine and Champagne operations, and during this period its members have destroyed 53 German machines which, added to others previously brought down, makes a total of 128 certainly demolished and 132 partly disabled. This battle on the Aisne, with its famous climax at the Chemin des Dames, began to slacken in July, and it was decided that the chasing squadrons, including the Storks, should be transferred to one of the British sectors where another offensive was being prepared. But before leaving the Fismes or Rheims district, Guynemer was active. He had not been given his new rank in the Legion of Honor to be idle. That was not his way. On the contrary, his habit was to show, after receiving a distinction as well as before, that he was worthy of it. On July 6th, he engaged 5 2-seaters and brought down 1 in flames. The next day, his notebook records 2 more victories. Attacked with Adjutant Boson-Verduras, 4 Albatros 1-seaters above Bremont. Downed 1 in flames north of Villers-Francois in our own lines. Attacked a DFW which spun down in our lines at Moussy. These victories, his 46th, 47th, and 48th, were his farewell to the Aisne. But these excessive exertions brought on nervous fatigue. The escadrille had only just reached its new station, when Guynemer had to go into hospital, whence he wrote his father on July 18th as follows: "Dear father, knocked out again. Hospital. But this time I'm flourishing. No more wooden barracks, but a farmhouse right in the fields. I have a room all to myself." Quite correct. I downed 3 Fritzes, 1 ablaze, and the next day again great sport. Mistook 4 Boches for Frenchmen. At first fought 3 of them, then 1 alone at 3,200 to 800 meters. He took fire. They will have to wait till the earth dries so they can dig him out. An hour later, a 2-seater turned up at 5,500. He blundered and fell straight down on a 75, which died of the shock. But so did the passenger. The pilot was simply a bit excited, for which he couldn't be blamed. His machine had not plunged, but came down slowly, with its nose twirling, and I got his 2 guns intact. The Toubib, doctor, says I shall be on my feet in 3 or 4 days. Don't see many Boches just now, but that won't last. I read in a newspaper that I had been mobbed in a friendly manner in Paris. I must be ubiquitous without knowing it. Modern science brings about marvels, modern journalism also. Raymond has 2 strings, officer's stripes, and the cross of the Legion. Please congratulate him. Good night, Father. George. P.S. I, who get seasick over nothing at all, have just been out to sea for the first time. The water was very rough, especially for a little motorboat, but I smiled serenely through it all. Wasn't I proud? In fact, some newspaper had announced that Guynemer would carry the aviation flag in the parade of the 14th of July in Paris, and this was enough to persuade the crowd that some other airman was Guynemer. Indeed, there had been talk of sending him to Paris on that solemn occasion, but he had declined. He loved glory, but hated show, and he had followed his squadron to Flanders, where he had taken to his bed. The foregoing letter bears Guynemer's mark unmistakably. The son of rich parents rejoicing over having a room to himself, after having renounced all comfort from the very first day of his enlistment, and willing to begin as garçon d'aérodrome. The joke about the German airplane sunk so deep in the wet ground that it would have to be dug out, and the surprise of the pilot, the delight over Raymond's promotion, the amusing allusion to seasickness by the man who had no equal in air navigation, are all characteristic details. Sheikh Jabias thus sums up his impressions after visiting the Cid in his camp. You dominated everything. Great, without leader, without yoke, without dam, absolute, spear in the fist, panache on the forehead, and that Cid had never fought up in the air.
4. Guynemer in his father's house.
To quote him once more, Sheikh Jabias, after being dazzled by the Cid in his camp, is supposed to see him in his father's castle at Bivar doing more humble work. So what happened? Who is this crew? I arrive, and I find you in your jacket like a page, outside, bare arms, bare head, and such a little boy that you have in hand the trough and the cavesson, and doing what becomes squires to do. Sheik, said the Cid, I am now with my father. Those who never saw Guynemer at his father's at Compiègne cannot know him well. Of course, even in camp he was the best of comrades, full of his work, but always ready to enjoy somebody else's success and speaking about his own as if it were billiards or bridge. His renown had not intoxicated him, and he would have been quite unconscious of it had he not sometimes felt that unresponsiveness on the part of others which is the price of glory. Anything like jealousy hurt him as if it had been his first discovery of evil. In Kipling's Jungle Book, Mowgli, the man-cub, noticing that the jungle hates him, feels his eyes and is frightened at finding them wet. What is this, Bagheera? He asks of his friend the panther. Oh, nothing, only tears, answers Bagheera, who had lived among men. One who, on occasion, told Guynemer not to mind, knows how deep was his sensitiveness, not to the presence of real hostility, which he fortunately never encountered, but even to an obscure germ of jealousy. The moment he felt this, he shrank into himself. His native exuberance only displayed itself under the influence of sympathy. Friendship among airmen is manly and almost rough, not caring for formulas or appearances, but proving itself by deeds. To these men, the games of war are astonishingly like school games, and are spoken of as if they were nothing else. When a comrade has not come back, and dinner has to begin without him, no show of sorrow is tolerated. Only these young men's hearts feel the absence of a friend, and the casual visitor, not knowing, might take them for sporting men, lively and jolly. Guynemer was living his life in perfect confidence, feeling no personal ambition, not inclined to enjoy honors more than work, ignoring all affectation or attitudinizing, never politic and naturally unconscious of his own simplicity. Yet he loved and adored what we call glory, and would tell anybody of his successes, even of his decorations, with a childlike certitude that these things must delight others as much as himself. His French honors were of course his great pride, but he highly appreciated those which he had received from Allied governments, too: the Distinguished Service Order, the Cross of St. George, the Cross of Leopold, the Belgian War Medal, Serbian and Montenegrin orders, etc. All these ribbons made a bright show, and, although he generally wore only the rosette of the Legion of Honor, he would sometimes deck himself out in them all, or carry them in his pocket and occasionally empty them out on a table, as at school he used to tumble out the untidy contents of his desk in search of his task. When he went to Paris to see to his machines, he first secured a room at the Hotel Edouard VII, and immediately posted to the bookworks. When he had time, he would invite himself to dinner at the house of his schoolmate at the Collège Stanislas, Lieutenant Constantin. Every time he came, this officer writes, some new exploit or a new decoration had been added to his list. He never wore all his medals, his village band banner, as he amusingly called them. But when people asked to see them, he immediately searched his pockets and produced the whole disorderly lot. When he became officer in the Legion, he appeared at my mother's quite radiant, so that she asked him the reason of this unusual joy. Regardez bien, madame, there is something new. The new thing which my mother discovered was a tiny rosette ornamenting his red ribbon. This rosette was so very small that nobody noticed it, and Guynemer felt that he must complain to the shopman at the Palais Royal who had sold it to him. "Give me a larger one, a huge one," he said. "Nobody sees this." The tradesman spread a number of rosettes on his counter, but Guynemer only took back again the one of which he had complained, and went out laughing as if the whole thing had been a good joke. His officer's stripes gave him as much pleasure as his decorations. Every time he was promoted, he wanted his stripes sewn on, not in a day or an hour or even 5 minutes, but immediately. He received his captain's commission the same day he had been given the Distinguished Service Order, and he promptly went to see his friend, Captain de la Tour, who was wounded in the hospital at Nancy. This officer had lost 3 brothers in action, and loved Guynemer as if he had been another younger brother. Indeed, Guynemer said later that La Tour loved him more than any other did. "Don't you see any change in me?" Guynemer asked. "No, you're just as usual." "No, there's a change." "Oh, I see, you mean your English order, it does look well." "There's something else, look closer." La Tour at last discovered the 3 stripes on the cap and sleeves. "What, are you a captain?" "Yes, a captain." And Guynemer laughed his boyish laugh. "This kid a captain. So I am not an impressive captain, then? I haven't run risks enough to be a captain, probably." His laugh said all this. Lieutenant Constantin also says in his notes, Guynemer disliked walking about Paris because people recognized him. When he saw them turn to look at him, he would grumble at the curse of having a face that was public property. So he preferred waiting for evening and then drove his little white car up the Champs-Élysées to the Bois. He enjoyed this peaceful recreation thoroughly and forgot the excitement of his life at the front. Memories of our boyhood days came back to him, and he dwelt on them with delight. "Do you remember one day in second when we quarreled and fought like madmen? You made such a mark on my arm that it is there yet." He did not mind, but I was ashamed of having been such a young brute. Another day, in May 1917, coming home on leave, I met Georges just as he stepped out of his hotel, and as I had just been mentioned in dispatches, I told him about it. Immediately, he dragged me into a shop, bought a croix de guerre, pinned it on my varos, and hugged me before everybody. Guynemer had a genius for graciousness, and his imagination was inexhaustible when he wished to please, but his temper was hot and quick. One day he had left his motor at the door of the hotel, and some practical joker thought it clever to leave a note in the car with this inscription in large letters, "Aviators to the front." Guynemer did not take the joke at all, and was boiling with rage. His complete freedom from conceit has often been remarked. At a luncheon given in his honor by the well-known deputy, Captain Lazy's, he would not say a word about himself, but extolled his comrades until somebody said, "You are really modesty itself." Whereupon another guest asked, "Could you imagine him bragging?" Guynemer was delighted, and when the party broke up, he went out with the gentleman who had said this and thanked him warmly. Don't you see how little they understand? I don't say I am modest, but if I weren't, I would be a fool, and I should not like to be that. I know quite well that just now some of us are getting so much admiration and so many honors that one may get more than one's share, whereas the men in the trenches, how different it is with them. But it was inevitable that he should be lionized. People came to him with albums and pictures. He wrote to his father that a Madame de B wanted something, just one sentence, in an album which was to be sold in America. I am to be alongside the Generalissimo. What on earth can I write? An American lady who was also a guest at the Hôtel Edouard VII wanted to have at any price some souvenir of the young hero. She ordered her maid to bring away an old glove of Guynemer's, which was lying on a chest of drawers, and replace it by a magnificent bouquet. "This lady put me in a nice dilemma," Guynemer explained, "as it was Sunday and there was no way of getting any more gloves." He had no affectation, least of all the kind that pretends to be ignorant of one's own popularity. But surely he cared little for popularity. Here again he puts us in mind of a medieval poem. In Gilbert de Metz, one of our oldest epics, the daughter of Annecy is described seated at the window, fresh, slim, and white as a lily, when two knights, Garin and his cousin Gilbert, happen to ride near. "Look up, cousin Gilbert," says Garin. "Look, by Our Lady, what a handsome dame." "Oh," answers Gilbert, "what a handsome creature my steed is. I never saw anything so lovely as this maiden with her fair skin and dark eyes. I never knew any steed that could compare with mine," and so on, while Gilbert still refuses to look up at the beautiful daughter of Annecy. Also in Gerard de Vienne, Charlemagne, holding his court at the Palace of Vienne, has just placed the hand of the lovely Aude in that of his nephew, Roland. Both the girl and the great soldier are silent and blushing while the date of the wedding is being discussed, when a messenger suddenly rushes in. "The Saracens are in France! War, war!" shout the bystanders. Then, without a word, Roland drops the white hand of the girl, springs to arms, and is gone. So Guynemer would have praised his Newport or his Spade as Gilbert praised his steed, and Belle Aude herself could not have kept him away from the fight. One day his father felt doubts about the capacity of such a young man to resist the intoxication of so much flattery from men and women. "Don't worry," Guynemer answered. "I am watching my nerves as an acrobat watches his muscles. I have chosen my own mission, and I must fulfill it." After his death, one of his friends, the one who spoke to him last, told me, "He used to put aside heaps of flattering letters which he did not even read. 'Read them if you like,' he said to me, and I destroyed them. He only read letters from children, schoolboys, and soldiers." In L'Aiglon, Prokesh brings the mail to the Prince Imperial, and handing him letters from women, he says, "So what it's like to have the fatal halo." As soon as Prokesh begins to read them, the prince stops him with the words, "I'm tearing up." Even when a woman, whom he has nicknamed Little Spring, because the water sleeping in her eyes or purling in her voice has often cooled his fever, announces her departure, hoping he may detain her, he lets her go, whispering again like a refrain, "I'm tearing up." Did Guynemer deal with hearts as he dealt with the besieging letters, or as the falcon of Saint Jean Hospitalier dealt with birds? No Little Spring, had her voice been ever so rill-like, could have detained him when a sunny morning invited him skywards. Safe from the admiring public, Guynemer would relax and breathe freely with his people at Compiègne, where he became once more a lively, noisy, indulged but coaxing and charming boy, except when absorbed in work, from which nothing could distract him. He spent hours in pasting and classifying the snapshots he took of his enemies just before pulling the trigger of his machine gun and bringing them down. One of his greatest pleasures, when on leave, was to arrange and show these photographs. His eyes, which saw everything, were keen to detect the least changes in the arrangement of his home, even when mere knickknacks had been moved about. At each visit, he found the house ornamented with some new trophy of his exploits. He was delighted to find that a miniature barkentine, which he had built with corks, paper, and thread when he was 7 years old, still stood on his mother's mantelpiece. Even at that age, his powers of observation had been evident, and he had forgotten no detail of sails or rigging. He had taken again so naturally his old place in the family circle that his mother forgot once and called the tall, famous young man by his old familiar name, Bébé. She quickly corrected herself, but he said, "I am always that to you, mother." "I was happier when you were little," she observed. "I hope you are not vexed with me, mother." Vexed for what? For having grown up. He was naturally full of the one subject that interested him, airplanes and chasing, and he would go round the house collecting audiences. Strange bits of narration could be overheard from different rooms as he held forth. "Then I embusked myself, became a slacker." What? "Oh, I embusked myself behind a cloud," or "the light dazzled me, so I hid the sun with my wing." He never forgot his sisters' birthdays, but he could not always give them the present he preferred. "Sorry I could not present you with a Boche," He was hardly different when his mother received company. He was never seen to play the great man. Only on one subject he always and instantly became serious, namely when the future was mentioned. "Do not let us make any plans," he would say. A page from one of my own notebooks will help to show Guynemer as I used to see him in his home. Wednesday, June 27, 1917. Compiègne, called on the Guynemers. He is fascination itself with his goddess on the cloud's gate, as if he remembered when walking that he could also fly. With his incomparable eyes, his perpetual movement, his interior electricity, his admixture of elegance and ardor, and with that impulse of his whole being towards one object, which suggests the antique runner, even when he is for an instant in repose. His parents and sisters do not miss a single gesture, a single motion he makes. They drink in his every word, and his life seems to absorb them. His laugh echoes in their souls. They believe in him, are sure of him, sure of his future, and that all will be well. Noticing this certitude, whether real or assumed, I could not help stealing a glance at the frail god of aviation, made like the delicate statuettes that we dread breaking. He talks passionately, as usual, of his aerial fights, but just now one thought seems to supersede every other. He is expecting a new machine, a magic machine which he planned long ago, found difficult to get built, and with which he must do more damage than ever. Then he showed us his photographs with the white blotches of bursting shells, or the gray wings of German airplanes. One of these is seen as it falls in flames, the pilot falling too, some distance away from it. Thus the victim was registered, and the memory of it made him happy. I swallowed a question I was going to ask. What about yourself, someday? Because he looked so full of life that the notion of death could never present itself to him. But he seemed to have read my thoughts, for he said, "You have plenty of time in the air, except when you fight, and then you have no time at all. I've been brought down 6 times, and I always had plenty of time to realize what was happening." And he laughed his clear, boyish laugh. As a matter of fact, he has been incredibly lucky. In one fight he was hit 3 times, and each time the bullet was deadened by some unexpected obstacle. Finally, I was shown photographs of himself, chronologically arranged. Needless to say, it was not he who showed them. There was the half-nude baby, with eyes already sparkling and eager, then the schoolboy with the fine carriage of the head, then the lad fresh from school with a singularly calm expression, and well-filled-out cheeks. A little later the expression appeared more mature and tense, though still ingenuous. Later again there was a decidedly stern look, with the face less oval and thinner. The rough fingers of war had chiseled this face, and sharpened and strengthened it. I looked from the picture to him, and I realized that compared to his former pictures, his expression had now indeed acquired something terrible. But just then he laughed, and the laughter conjured away all fantasies.
5. The Magic Machine.
As a tiny boy who had invented an enchanted bed for his sister's dolls, as a boy who, at Collège Stanislas, had rigged up a telephone to send messages to the last forms in the schoolroom or manufactured miniature airplanes, as a recruit who, at Pau, had gladly accepted the work of cleaning, burnishing, and overhauling engines, Guynemer had always shown a passion for mechanics. Becoming a pilot, and later on a chaser, he exhibited in the study and perfecting of his airplanes the same enthusiasm and perseverance as in his flights. He was everlastingly calling for swifter or more powerful machines, and not only strove to communicate his own fervor to technicians, but went into minute details, suggested improvements, and whenever he had a chance visited the workshops and assisted at trials. Such trials are sometimes dangerous. One of his friends, Edouard Delaines, was killed in this kind of accident, and Guynemer was enraged that a gallant airman should perish otherwise than in battle. He was in reality an inventor, though this statement may cause surprise, and though it may not be wise at present to bear it out by facts. Every part of his machine or of his gun was familiar to him. He had handled them all, taking them apart and putting them together again. There are practical improvements in modern airplanes which would not be there had it not been for him. And there is a Guynemer visor. Confidence and authoritativeness had not come to him along with glory, for from the first he talked as one engrossed by his ideas, and it is because he was thus engrossed that he found persuasive words to bring others round to his views. But naturally enough, he had not at first the prestige which he possessed when he became Captain Guynemer, had high rank in the Legion of Honor, and enjoyed worldwide fame. In his prentice days, when, in workshops or in the presence of well-known builders, he would make confident statements, inveigh against errors, or demand modifications, people thought him flippant and saucy. Once somebody called him a raw lad. The answer came with crushing rapidity. When you blunder, raw lads like myself pay for your mistakes. It must be admitted that, like most people brought up with wealth, he was apt to be unduly impatient. Delays or objections irritated him. He wanted to force his will upon time, which never admits compulsion, and tried to override obstacles. His peculiar fascination gradually won its way even in workshops, and his appearance there was greeted with acclamation, not only because the men were curious to see him, but because they were in sympathy with him and had put his ideas to a successful test. The workmen liked to see him sit in a half-finished machine and explain in his short, decisive style what he wanted and what was sure to give superiority to French aviation. The men stopped work, came round, and listened eagerly. This, too, was a triumph for him. What he told them on such occasions he had probably whispered to himself many times before when, on rainy days, he would sit in his airplane under the hangar and think and talk to himself, while strangers wondered if he was not crazy. However, he had made friends with well-known engineers, especially Major Garnier of Puteaux and Monsieur Bechereau of the Spadworks. These two, instead of dismissing him as a snappish airman continually at variance with the builder, took his invention seriously and strove to meet his requirements. When Monsieur Bechereau, after long delays, was at last decorated for his eminent services, the Secretary of Aeronautics, Monsieur Daniel Vincent, came to the works and was going to place the medal and red ribbon on the engineer's breast when he saw Guynemer standing near. He graciously handed the medal over to the airman, saying, "Give Monsieur Bechereau his decoration. It is only fair you should." In September 1916, Guynemer had tried at the front one of the first two Spads. On the 8th, he wrote to Monsieur Bechereau, "Well, the Spad has had her baptême du feu. The others were 6. An Aviatic at 2,800, an LVG at 2,900, and 4 Rumplers jostling one another, with barely 25 meters in between, at 3,000 meters. When the 4 saw me coming, at 1,800 on the speedometer, they no doubt took me for a meteorite and funked, and when they got over it and back to their shooting, fine popping though, it was too late. My gun never jammed once." Here he went into technicalities about his new machine gun, but further on reverted to the Spad. She loops wonderfully. Her spin is a bit lazy and irregular, but deliciously soft. The letter concludes with many suggestions for minor improvements. His correspondence with Monsieur Bechereau was entirely devoted to a study of airplanes. He never wandered from the subject. Thus he collaborated with the engineer by constantly communicating to him the results of his experience. His machine gun was the great difficulty. "Yesterday," he wrote on October 21, 1916, 5 Boches, 3 of them above our lines, came within 10 meters of the muzzle of my gun and impossible to shoot. 4 days ago I had to let 2 others get away. Sickening. The weather is wonderful. Perhaps the gun will work now." In fact, a few days later he wrote exultingly, having discovered that the jamming was due to cold, and having found an ingenious remedy. November 4, 1916. Day before yesterday I bagged a Fokker 1-seater biplane. It was 2 meters off, but as it tumbled into a group of our Nieuports, the controlling board would not give the victory to anybody. Yesterday got an Aviatic 10 meters off. Passenger shot dead by the first bullet. The plane, all in rags, went down in slow spirals and must have been knocked flat somewhere near Berlincourt. Hurto, who had seen it beginning to fall, brought one down himself 10 minutes later, like a regular ball. On November 18th, next, after going into particulars concerning his engine, which he wanted made stronger, he told Monsieur Bechereau of his 21st and 22nd victories. As for the 21st, it was a 1-seater I murdered as it twirled in elegant spirals down to its own landing ground. Number 22 was a 220 horsepower, one of 3 above our lines. I came upon it unawares in a somersault. Passenger stood up, but fell down again in his seat before even setting his gun going. I put some 200 or 250 bullets into him 20 meters away from me. He had taken an invariable angle of 45 degrees on the first volley. When I let him go, Adjutant Bouquet took him in hand, which would have helped if he hadn't already been as full of holes as a strainer. He kept his angle of 45 degrees till about 500 meters, when he adopted the vertical and blazed up on crashing to the ground. The Spad ravished him. It was the heyday of wonderful flights on the Somme. Yet he wanted something even better. But before pestering Monsieur Bechereau, he began with an inspiring narrative. December 28, 1916. I can't grumble, yet yesterday I missed my camera badly. I had a high-class round with an albatross, a fine, clever fellow between 2 and 10 meters away from me. We only exchanged 15 shots, and he snapped my right forecable, just a few threads still held, while I shot him in the small of his back. A fine spill, number 25. Now, to speak of serious things, I must tell you that the Spad 150 horsepower is not much ahead of the Halberstadt. The latter is not faster, I admit, but it climbs so much more quickly that it amounts to the same thing. However, our latest model knocks them all out. The letter adds only some recommendations as to the necessity for more speed and a better propeller. But much more important improvements were already filling his mind. He had conceived plans for a magic airplane that would simply annihilate the enemy, and as he would doggedly carry on a fight, so he ruminated, begged, and urged until his idea was realized. But he was forced to practice exhausting perseverance, and on several occasions the lack of comprehension or sympathy which he encountered infuriated him. Yet he never gave up. It was not his way in a workshop, any more than in the air, and when, after some 10 months struggling, trying, and frequent beginning over again, he saw himself at last in possession of the wonderful machine, he rejoiced as a warrior may after forging his own weapons. In January 1917, he wrote to Monsieur Bechereau, urging him to make all dispatch. Spring will soon be here, and the Germans are working like niggers. If we go to sleep, it will be queek for us. Henceforth his correspondence, sometimes rather dictatorial, with the engineer was entirely devoted to the magic airplane, its size, controls, wingtips, tank, weight, etc. The margins of his letters were covered with drawings, and every detail was minutely discussed. In February he wrote to his father as if he had been a builder. My machine surpasses all expectations, and will soon be at work. In Paris I go to bed early and rise ditto, spending all day at Spads. I have no other thought or occupation. It is a fixed idea, and if it goes on I shall become a perfect idiot. When peace is signed, let nobody dare to mention a weapon of any kind in my presence for 6 months. He thought himself within reach of his goal, but unexpected obstacles would come in his way, and it was not till July 5th, 1917, the same day on which he received the rosette of the Legion of Honor from General Franchet d'Espèrey at the Aisne Aviation Camp, that he could at last try the long-dreamed-of, long-hoped-for airplane. But in a fight against 3 DFWs, the splendid new machine got riddled with bullets. He had to land, and everything had to be begun over again. But Guynemer was not afraid of beginning over again, and in fact he was to give the airplane another chance in Flanders and to see all his expectations fulfilled. The 49th, 50th, 51st, and 52nd victories of Guynemer were due to the magic airplane. He managed to impose his will on matter and on those who adapt it to the warlike conceptions of man, as he imposed it on the enemy. Then, spreading out his wings on high, he might well think himself invincible.
This concludes today's reading of Georges Guynemer, Knight of the Air, by Henry Bordeaux. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent chapter, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at antonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.